Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachael Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started. Thank you for joining us. We have been in the midst of a series on authority, talking about our suspicion of authority, what happens when we distrust authority, what happens when authority is wicked, how do we discern, who is authorized by Jesus. And today we're going to tackle the really fun topic of what does it mean to submit to authority. And I just want to say these are really hard conversations to have. And I was talking with Dan in preparation just about how even some of the language like submission, authority, to be under is language that just is triggering. It's embodied, it's enstoried, and it's very loaded. So we want to, again, just acknowledge we are in complex waters, and yet waters we feel compelled to at least engage because in many ways this is a function of our world, and we want to grow in a capacity to imagine what it is to live more faithfully as people, and as people who need help discerning what is good authority, and therefore then what does it mean to submit? So Dan, I'm going to let you take it from here.
I'm so grateful, Rachael, that you have named the agonies that many of our listeners have suffered. It is the issue of trauma through betrayal, feeling foolish, having trusted perhaps again and again, and then been violated, or then told, as many of the folks that we work with who've been sexually abused, that they just need to forgive. They just need to trust that God is going to use this and work through it, and basically submit to authority, keep your mouth shut, do what's right, and you won't be hurt. We're back to that misunderstanding of what Romans 13 is actually about. But as we move into the issue of submission, I'm looking at the NIV right now. And, the way the translators position the text, it's not the way it's in the actual text of Scripture in Koine Greek. So, for example, I'm looking at the passage in Ephesians 5:21, and if you look at your own NIV, it says, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." Then you have the headings, wives and husbands, and you have verse 22, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Well, notice that there's a paragraph, an indentation, a new paragraph with verse 21. In other words, it's cut off from verse 22. It's as if it's a paragraph with one sentence, which we know is not the way you write a paragraph. And yet that's the choice the translators make, because they're trying to make a decision. Is that passage that about mutual submission, is that governing the rest of the passage that comes after, or is it the ending of the passage that comes before it? And they really have chosen a very cowardly middle ground of a new paragraph, but then not linking it to what comes after. All I'm saying is we're in hot water. And at least from my standpoint, it is cowardly the way the NIV has chosen. I think verse 20 guides everything that follows. You and I are to be mutually submissive to one another. I'm to be mutually submissive to my wife to me. That's how we govern what comes after that particular passage. So when we talk about mutuality, I'd love to hear what you put words to as to what that actually means between the two of us.
Yeah, I mean, to me, mutual submission is just different language for what it means to love, to bring respect, to bring honor, to cultivate trust, to consider my neighbor as myself, to love my neighbor as I love myself. It's a relational movement toward another. And in many ways, I was laughing because I was thinking about how many wedding ceremonies I heard language of just the wife naming she would be submitting to her husband that was used as like a biblical foundation. And I do not say this to shame anyone, because I think there's something really beautiful about that language. But, you just officiated my wedding 4 months ago, and I chose not to bring the language of submission into our ceremony. One, because I didn't have time to preach to the people and bring a sermon that would help unpack this text. Two, because in many ways, I felt like the entirety of our ceremony, the vows we were sharing to each other, the commitments we were making to consider each other, to love each other, to learn each other, to serve each other, were actually comprehensively covering that. And so to me, it is a little bit of this sense of like learning to love, anticipating, honoring, repenting where repentance is needed, and a mutual authorization, a mutual empowerment, a mutual consideration of the other.
Well, let's go back to your wedding. And maybe someday we'll do an episode on your vows. They were some of the most beautiful, glorious, and lengthy vows I've ever heard, including you had to ask for a book to be given to you from a friend. Basically, at one point, give me the book, and you read a significant section out of a book as part of your vows. So when you say you didn't have time to preach, I just want to say, well, not as much as you could have, but it was a glorious preaching. And let's talk about that, because, I had the privilege, along with our dear friend Jen Murphy, to officiate. We had authority to officiate. We were officials in your wedding, and yet you and Michael gave us essentially a beautiful outline of what you wanted for the ceremony. and what did I?
Yeah, that's what happens when you have two pastors, crafting, two pastors who have both officiated multiple weddings.
Absolutely.
Planning their own ceremony.
And what did Jen and I say to you?
I'm going to need you to refresh my memory. There was a lot going on in that season.
We said we would love to follow, but we will bring our sense of what needs to be said. And you were like, I remember you looking at Jen, who is much more trustworthy than me, and you looked at her and you said, "Will you be able to contain him?"
But I also said, I'm aware you'll need to go rogue. And I blessed that.
Indeed. And I think I was, in one sense, bound to what you wished, while simultaneously being free to say what I believe the Spirit and my own heart wanted to say. To me, it's a perfect picture of what mutual submission is. It's playful, creative. It's a level of entering into conflict. And if the passage can be gone back to in Ephesians 5:20, it's out of fear, out of reverence. Actually, though the word is translated reverence, the actual Greek word is phobos, out of fear. And it's not that I fear you, it's that I don't want to bring heartache at such a glorious moment of being part of your wedding. I want goodness, and I know I have the potential to go too rogue. But on the other hand, that sense of we will hem one another in to goodness. I'm under you. I am under you to serve you for a greater good to be part, that I get to be part of. That's what we're underscoring, that there really is a beauty to, in one sense, and I'm going to bring up another very complex passage, but the ability to, in one sense, say, it's not my body that I have authority over, I actually give that authority to you. And this is much more in the framework of a marital relationship, where Paul says, as he's talking about sexuality in 1 Corinthians 7, that a husband doesn't own his own body, but he owns the body of his wife. But then immediately says, and a wife doesn't own her body, she owns the body of her husband. Oh my gosh, if you talk about where I just want to say to Paul, do you have any clue, pal, what you're setting loose for the potential of misunderstanding? I mean, I do hope I one day get at least a couple minutes with Paul just to kind of look at him and go, what were you thinking, guy? But nonetheless, this is one of those passages that can be cruelly misused. In our marriage, Becky doesn't own her body, I do. But I don't own my body, she does, which means it's not going to work. It's going to be complex and difficult. I can't demand what my body wants because I don't own it. On the other hand, I must care for her body as if it's mine. In other words, you're right back to what the great summary of the law is, and that is to love your Lord, your God, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So in that same sense of what mutual submission means, I am to love you and serve you as I would wish for my own body to be served.
Yes. And man, these are hard words. I just want to own these are really hard words to hear because of how they've so been misused. And in some ways I find myself even like, how do we reclaim and open up meaning in phrases and passages that have been so wickedly used to wreak havoc? And in some ways, I wonder if that's part of what the complexity and danger that Paul is playing with in a cultural context that would have actually had a built-in sense of ownership over certain bodies. And so I do think it's really hard for us to imagine, because I don't actually think he's saying you literally don't own and occupy your body. He's making a comment about relationship, about love, about submission. But how do you submit to something you don't occupy, you don't embody, you don't have authorization of, to give away, to commit to another? So, I just feel that these are nuanced spaces that we're leaning into.
You're bringing up again the cultural context in that day. Truly, women would have been chattel. They were owned. So in that sense, this is a stunningly feminist statement that a man doesn't own his body, even if he thinks he owns his wife's body. But I couldn't agree with you more. It is not saying you don't actually have ownership and responsibility over your own body, but it is this commitment to paradox that you, in your engagement with another, must have I will serve you, but that service will be, in one sense, the disruption of the norms of what is expected in almost all relationships. I mean, you're a young woman, and I'm an older man, and I'm called to submit to you, not just in what you wish for your wedding, but in how we engage the material before we talk on a podcast. I'm grateful we spend time talking, praying, preparing, and then stepping in. But in that mutual submission, we take the risk that the real call of submission is, I must honor and delight in you because of who you are and who you're meant to be. And equally, you're to honor and delight in me, but that doesn't remove conflict. It opens up to the possibility that conflict can actually create a goodness in what we create together. So it's yes, I think one of the things we're keeping before you as the audience is there is agony in these passages. But if we don't have the courage to come back into them, then we're really giving authority to our past harm or authority to those who have misused these passages and actually then not choosing to enter into the goodness of what it calls us to become.
Yeah, and I think that that's where I would love for us to spend some time. How do we interact with those who have authority? If there's this sense of mutual submission is to be at play, let's unpack a little bit more with particularity. Like, what do we actually mean by that? Because I love that you're saying it allows conflict to come into this space with the constant boundary lines of honor and delight and love. So how do we interact with those in authority?
Well, the first thought that comes to mind is I love blessing you. And I love the idea that I get to advance in whatever authority I have. I get to advance you, your work, your thought, your life. I get to advance and bless Michael, your husband, and his unique giftedness, because to bless you is to bless him. And to bless you and him is to bless your two children. And so in that sense, it's like a circle of blessing. And the question then is, how can I do so, even in a context like this, to be able to say, I love you. I so delight to be with you. I love the wisdom you bring and what you've taught me. Though that's, I think, the essence of what it means to work for somebody. Can you bless them? Do you see good in them? Not that we're unwilling and unable to see our own brokenness, but do we want good for the other? And do we see how uniquely we can bring good to the other?
And I love what you're saying, Dan. And also I want to say thank you. I received that blessing, and I actually feel that blessing from you. And I think you are a unique man in authority in the generosity and ways that you bless many of us who have had the privilege to, in some ways, to submit to your authority and to be in friendship and mentorship and colleagues together. And I think that sense of, if we can't start with blessing, if there's not blessing to be found, we're already in trouble, because we have to bring our full self to this task of mutual submission. We have to speak. We have to risk. We have to follow up in hard conversations. We have to grow in wisdom and patience. We have to, not forsake concerns. We have to bring our concerns together. That's a form of love. And if I don't have a posture of blessing, then to bring those things without a sense of blessing that goes ever before me will lead to a lot of harm. And I think that those are hard things to hold together, because one of the things I so appreciate about you is you invite me to bring my full self to this task of podcasting, the task of the teaching we do at the Allender Center. But I think in some ways you can trust me to bring my full self in the ways I might, bring concerns. It might take risks to speak truth in love, because you trust that I love you and that there is blessing for you.
Oh, indeed. And yet there have just been moments where we've looked at one another and probably you could see the fume coming out of our ears. So again, I don't want to give any sense to our audience that it's just beautiful. It's just always good. It's like any friendship, but in this case, both friendship, but also colleagues, where there has to be, I can remember times where you've just said to me, no, we're not going to do that. And I'm going, literally, I've wanted to go, look, the damn institution's named after me. And I can't help but just laugh at times to go, that Jesus is looking at me going, and you're a benefactor, right? So in part, can we grow together in the grace and skill of this interplay of humility and courage? The ability to say, I will not, I lose my integrity all the time, but it's out of my own brokenness and sin. I'm not going to sustain the loss of my integrity by staying in an authority relationship with someone who I think is not excellent, not growing. So in that sense, I'll either quit or move to another place or job. I'm just not going to submit my very being to somebody who is, at least in my heart, clearly not growing in their own grace and skill to live well. So, but on the other hand, that does require that, sometimes civil disobedience means you're going to end up in jail. And I'd rather have order, even when there is a failure of integrity. I don't want anarchy. And so this tension between disordered order and utter anarchy, we're going to live in the middle and say there are times where you may get fired because of your integrity. You may need to move into another work because you really can't bless and honor those whom you are called to submit to by putting yourself under to serve to bring a greater good.
And those are really painful places, because the reality is there's usually still love in the midst of that, and there's still hope in the midst of that, and there's still faith in the midst of that. So learning where you can't, I just think that as a rubric, can you bless and honor someone that is in authority over you, and not just out of selfishness, not just out of only suspicion, but where there have been breaks of integrity, where you're not seeing someone pursue a greater growth, a greater wisdom, a greater grace, a greater sense of integrity for themselves. Man, like to be willing to, pay the price of your integrity, to bear the cost of actually what I would say loving well, and those places are often hard. When we're in a relational community context, those places are often hard because they usually have come after many attempts to bring your full self to the task, to invite people to grow in love, to invite people to grow in freedom, a deeper freedom to love, to undergo the grace of God in a way that says this doesn't have to be the final story. This isn't your only opportunity, and especially in a culture that kind of prioritizes the ways we define ourselves and our personalities. So again, these are such tender, such human, such complex places to be. But our hope is that we have brought some language, some rubric, some framework to how do we live in a context where we are in the midst of those in authority, or where we bear authority. And we didn't get to go there in this series, and maybe that's just one for another day. But the reality is all of us have places where we have authority, whether it be as a parent, whether it be in a marriage, whether it be in our workplace. And so we know both movements, and I don't think we are bound to suspicion or bound to compliance.
Well, for me, as we end this particular series, I can just say this feels more frail than a lot of the other work we've done, because we know we're walking on thin ice. We know we have our own issues, because I am a man in authority. I'm also a man under authority, and both bear heartache and failure on my part. And that process of being able to say, but I know Jesus is my authority, and I'm called to live with and under for authority in ways that continue to call my own heart away from just the war of betrayal into a new level of faithfulness. So thank you, Rachael, and thank our audience for staying with us through this process.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.